Renowned investor Warren Buffett recently weighed in on the United States' mounting national debt, sparking global discussions. In his candid remarks, Buffett acknowledged that the U.S. might never fully repay its national debt, but he emphasized that the world will likely come to terms with this reality. Why? Because there simply aren't many alternatives. The U.S. dollar remains the backbone of the global financial system, and Treasury securities are still seen as the safest assets in the world. Buffett explained that while other nations might look for alternatives, none offer the stability, liquidity, and trust associated with U.S. debt. As a result, the global economy will continue to rely on the U.S. financial system, even amid concerns about its fiscal trajectory. However, Buffett also issued a warning. He highlighted that ignoring the nation's growing fiscal imbalance could lead to inflation and other economic challenges down the road. His message was clear. The U.S. must eventually address its debt burden to preserve the confidence of investors and avoid economic instability. This perspective sheds light on the complex balance between reliance on the U.S. economy and the urgent need for fiscal responsibility. Buffett's remarks remind us of the critical role the U.S. stance plays in the global financial ecosystem, even as it faces mounting challenges. Call to action. If you found this discussion insightful, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more thought-provoking content on finance, global markets, and expert insights. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your followers to join the conversation.
These problems are problems that have built up over decades, and there hasn't been a Congress that's been mature enough or a president that's been mature enough to take this head on.
I could end the deficit in 5 minutes. You just pass a law that says that anytime there's a deficit of more than 3% of GDP, all sitting members of Congress are ineligible for re-election. Now you've got the incentives in the right place, right?
The U.S. national debt just hit a staggering $35 trillion, with a Congressional Budget Office saying the U.S. will never be able to repay this debt back. This number is growing with each passing second, and that is why, according to legendary investor Warren Buffett, the U.S. is teetering on the point of no return. The most alarming part isn't necessarily even the size of the national debt. Instead, it is the trend. You don't have to be a brilliant investor like Buffett to realize this is a terrifying chart. At the current trajectory of the U.S. federal deficit, it is only a matter of time until the size of the U.S. debt becomes significantly larger than the size of the U.S. economy. This has Buffett worried that the U.S. is potentially headed for the dreaded debt spiral, where the growing debt results in higher and higher interest payments that increase that debt even larger. Add in the inevitable inflation that will arise, and eventually the country crumbles under the weight of its debt, a process that has happened to countries and societies throughout history. Here's what Buffett had to say when asked about whether the size of the U.S. national debt was too big to handle.
Do you think that at some point in time the world market will no longer be able to absorb all of the U.S. debt being offered?
Well, I would say the answer, of course, I don't know, but my best speculation is that U.S. debt will be acceptable, but for a very long time, because there's not much alternative. But it won't be the quantity. The national debt was nothing to speak of, for a long, long time. And then, in any way, inflation would get let loose in a way that really threatened the whole world economic situation, and there really isn't any alternative to the dollar as a reserve currency. And you get a lot of people who give you a lot of speeches on that, but that really is the answer. That I don't worry about the quantity. I worry about the fiscal deficit, but I'm not a worrier just generally. I mean, I think about it, and I don't sit and get up, work myself into a stew about it in the least, but I can't help thinking about it, and we've got a great attention. It's interesting, and I think the media enters into this, and it focuses on the Fed, and they just love it because things are always happening, and economists are always saying what's going to happen with the Fed and everything else. But the fiscal deficit is what should be focused on, and Jay Powell is not only a great human being, but he's a very, very wise man. But he doesn't control fiscal policy, and every now and then he sends out a kind of this guy's plea for please pay attention to this, because that's where the trouble will be if we have it.
To understand where the U.S. economy goes from here, we first have to understand the basics. The most recent data shows the U.S. national debt at over $35 trillion, a number that is growing literally by the second. So how does this even happen in the first place? Just like an individual, a country goes into debt when it spends more money than it takes in. To demonstrate this point, let me introduce you to John. Our friend John here is a productive member of society and otherwise a great guy. He just so happens to have one pretty big vice. John has a spending problem. You see, each month John makes $5,000 from his job after taxes. This is the revenue side. For the expenses side, John spends $6,000 a month on things like his house, car, clothes, vacations, and going out to eat. The money to cover that $1,000 shortfall between John's revenue and expenses has to come from somewhere. This is where debt enters the picture. John has to go into $1,000 of debt to make up for the fact that the money coming in during the month wasn't enough to cover the amount of money that was going out in expenses during that month. Now, when this happens during just 1 month, it obviously is not good, but it's also not the end of the world. Where things start to get really worrisome for John is when this happens month after month, year after year. That debt starts to stack up pretty quickly. And to make matters worse, John has to pay interest on that debt each month. Those interest payments increase his expenses, and the amount John has to borrow each month grows, causing the debt pile to climb even faster. Eventually, the debt becomes simply too big to bear, and John has to default on the debt. This same basic logic applies to a country, but with let's just say, much larger numbers. In 2023, the U.S. government took in $4.4 trillion in revenue. Here's the breakdown of those revenue sources. Roughly half came from individual income taxes. About 36% came from what are known as payroll taxes. These are additional taxes both employees and employers pay to fund programs like Social Security. Another 10% or so came from corporate income taxes. The remainder is a category referred to as other, made up of things like customs duties, excise taxes, and estate and gift taxes. The expense side was $6.1 trillion, consisting of the following categories: Social Security accounting for approximately 21% of the spending, Medicare and Medicaid at 24%, income security programs such as food stamps and unemployment at 7%, non-defense discretionary spending such as certain education and healthcare programs at 15%, defense spending at 13%, and other at 8%. On top of all of those expenses, 11% of the federal budget in 2023 went to paying interest on debt incurred from previous years. The difference between what the federal government took in, $4.4 trillion, and what it spent, $6.1 trillion, is what is referred to as the federal deficit. As you can see in this chart here, 2001 was the last time the U.S. federal budget actually ran at a surplus. Each year since then, the federal government has run at a deficit that seems to get larger with each passing year. In order to reduce this deficit, the federal government either needs to bring in more money, spend less, or do some combination of both. As I'm sure you can imagine, all of these options are extremely unpopular. On the revenue side, not many people or companies willingly want to pay higher taxes. On the expenses side, cutting spending on programs such as Social Security, education, and healthcare would likely make for many upset constituents. The unpopularity of making these tough decisions is exactly why this problem is projected to continue getting worse. The Congressional Budget Office is projecting the federal deficit to balloon from $1.9 trillion in 2024 all the way to $2.9 trillion in 2034. The growing deficit is projected to cause the federal debt to grow at a much faster rate than the size of the U.S. economy. This is why the U.S. federal debt to GDP is expected to go all the way to 150% to 180% in the years to come, unlike anything the United States has ever seen, even during the depths of World War II. Levels that Buffett considers to be the point of no return for a country. Listen to what Buffett had to say way back in 1995 when he was asked at what point the U.S. national debt would become a major concern for him. Take a listen.
The net national debt would be about 60-odd% of GDP. There are a lot of measurements of how much debt is too much and all of that, but probably I think that if I had to look at one single statistic, I would look at that ratio of just like I would look at a ratio of debt to income for an individual. Then you'd get into the question of the stability of the income and to whom it is owed. But I do not think that the level of debt relative to the economy is of anything that's of a frightening nature. I like the idea of it trending downward a little bit over time rather than trending upward. And if it keeps trending upward, it can get awkward, although I think in Italy it's close to 150% now. And you start getting to 150% and talk 8% interest rates, and you're talking 12% of GDP essentially going to interest. I would not like to see debt rise at any rapid rate. I wouldn't like to see it rise at all, but I wouldn't like to see it particularly rise at a rapid rate, because that sets a lot of things in motion if it's rising as a percentage of GDP.
When Buffett says a high national debt to GDP can set some very bad things into motion, he is referring to what is known as a debt spiral. A debt spiral happens when a country's debt keeps growing out of control, leading to a vicious downward cycle that is almost impossible to stop. A debt spiral happens in 4 basic stages. The first stage is rising debt. In this stage, a country is spending more money than what it is taking in from taxes. It starts gradually at first, but year after year, the debt pile gets larger and larger as spending continuously exceeds how much money the country brings in. Eventually, the debt becomes so large that interest payments just to stay current on the debt start to become a meaningful portion of the country's annual budget. This leads to the second stage of the debt spiral, higher interest payments. As the debt balance continues to increase, lenders may see the country as a higher risk and charge higher interest rates, making borrowing even more expensive. As of the making of this video, the U.S. government pays a 3.35% interest rate on its current debt balance. Assuming a $35 trillion debt balance, every 1% rise in interest rates results in an additional $350 billion the U.S. government would have to pay in interest. That $350 billion number is roughly 8% of all the money the U.S. government took in from taxes in 2023. Just a 2 or 3 percentage point rise in interest rates is all it takes for those higher interest payments to start to take a meaningful chunk out of the revenue a country collects. This leads us directly into the third stage of the debt spiral, more borrowing. To cover these higher interest payments and continue funding its operations, the country borrows even more, further adding to the total debt burden. Stage 4 is the cycle continues. This cycle repeats over and over, year after year, making it harder and harder for the country to pay off its debt. This leads to a high risk of economic instability or default. Eventually, something has to give. Think of a debt spiral like a person who keeps using credit cards to pay off their other credit cards. At some point, the burden simply becomes unmanageable. Ultimately, only time will tell how things ultimately play out for the United States. However, one thing is for certain. Unless some very hard decisions are made, the U.S. deficit and national debt are projected to keep growing with each passing second, day, week, month, and year. The question is, at what debt level is the point of no return officially reached? If you have made it this far in the video, it is obvious you are serious about learning about investing, the economy, and how to make money. If that is the case, make sure to check out this video here, as Buffett shares his thoughts on the storm that is brewing within the real estate market. With 6 million views, Buffett's comments have definitely been getting people's attention.